So welcome again. Today's session is Environmental Policy 2, Getting People on Board. And our team today is myself, Noreen Lucy. I work as a sustainability consultant with Native Events. We have Katrina Fallon from the Green Arts Initiative, Claire Buckley from Julie's Bicycle worked with us on the creation of the presentation and slides. She's not with us today, but she's an integral part of our team. And we also have Brecken Byron from Native Events. She's program manager with us, and she's here assisting us on the technicalities of the webinar. So it's great to have you all here with us today. So the aims of this session really is, I suppose, to equip you with the steps that you need to take on, I suppose, how to involve your team and your external stakeholders in terms of planning on who the important people are in this process of creating your climate action policy and your action plan. And really our aim is that you will come away today with the skills and the resources that you need to write your climate action and environmental policy and to be able to start that process. So that's really the aims of today's session. What we will cover today is we will have a recap of the previous session. Katrina will go through last week's session in terms of creating your climate and environmental policy and provide you with a step-by-step approach in order to do that, and suggest some steps to guide you through that process so that from today you can start that process. We will speak about the importance of getting people on board. So really, I suppose, before you start working on the policy and the action plan, just to take a step back and to reflect on the important people that should be involved in developing your approach. We'll take a look at some different approaches to engagement. I suppose maybe most importantly, lessons learned on what not to do. We'll then look at how you identify and map your key people. So obviously your internal team, you'll know your internal team very well, but then I suppose to consider who are the people outside of your organization and those stakeholders, or that community of people, and how you identify them and how you, I suppose, understand their importance in the process. We'll look at some nice examples of team engagement, and we'll provide a summary of some do's and don'ts, and then of course we'll allow time for questions towards the end. I suppose we just wanted to get a sense of how you're doing today. I suppose this is our second webinar, and prior to that, we had the road shows where we were meeting you in person, and that was great in terms of meeting people and having conversations, and we do miss that with the webinar format. So we just wanted to offer the opportunity today to maybe hear how you're feeling, and maybe one or two words and pop that in the chat for us. Maybe it's you're, I suppose, kind of feeling excited about getting started on the policy and the action plan. Hopefully you're not like the images there in G and I, but I suppose this is our way of checking in with you and seeing how you're doing today. So if anyone wants to let us know how they're feeling, that would be great, just to give us a chance to hear from you today. Very good. Okay, it's just, I suppose, it's how we can engage with you, because it is difficult with the webinar format to have that engagement. But thank you so much for letting us know how you're doing today.
And we understand that sense of overwhelm as well. I suppose it's important to say, Noreen.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I suppose today's session is, I suppose, us acknowledging that we really need to give you those practical steps in terms of walking away from today and saying, yeah, no, I feel I can start my policy. I have the tools. I have that understanding. So hopefully, this will get you started on the creation or the co-creation of the policy and action plan. So we're going to ask you to do one more thing for us. We're going to launch a poll or a quiz. So it's just, I suppose, to get a sense of who we have in the webinar today. But what's coming up there really is art centres, visual art venues, production company, theatre, resource organisation, and a festival, and an artist, printmaker, studio and publishing, and some others. So there's a real mix. I think we have representation from all of those organisations. and then some others in the chat. So that's fantastic, really. That's that'll give us a good spread of everybody. And that's important for us as well, because we want to ensure that, you know, we're speaking to all of you, and you know, there will be differences in your approach depending on your organization. So if there was any others in the chat maybe that we wanted to acknowledge, but I think that's a really nice mix.
There's some crossover, you know, like a dance resource organization, so an art form specific organization, but a resource organization. Okay. So we're aware there's quite a lot of overlap. And Helium Arts, yes, so it's very much a focus on young people with lifelong medical conditions. So yeah, absolutely, there are so many very different. There's a huge diversity of organisations in this group, so we very much respect that.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So thank you for that. So I suppose just to recap again, in terms of our timeline for the training, we're on our second webinar. So talking about how to get people on board today on the 18th of June. I suppose just to give you a recap, we'll have 2 sessions, one in the morning, which will be developing action plans for public facing buildings and bigger energy users. And then in the afternoon, we will have a similar session, but focused on office-based organizations and production companies. On the 25th of June, we will have a webinar on measuring impacts. And then moving into July, on the 2nd of July, the webinar will be on nature and biodiversity. On the 9th of July, it will be focused on buildings and energy. And then on the 16th of July, it will be on materials and procurement. And then in September and October, we're going to host some webinars for festivals, because obviously this is a very busy time for festivals. So we wanted to give festivals the opportunity to attend those webinars live. So now I will pass on to my colleague, Katrina.
So just a quick and maybe not so quick recap on the previous session. Many of you will hopefully have been at the previous session. We created an online resource for that, so you'll be able to see it. I think Brecon has confirmed earlier on that it should be up on the Arts Council's website by tomorrow, certainly by the end of the week. So technically, these 2 sessions together should just give you the bones of creating a draft environmental policy. And what did we cover in the last session? We did an introduction to environmental policies. We looked at the context for creating those policies. So that was the national context, but also the sectoral context. We looked at the key steps in developing an environmental policy, some do's and don'ts. We looked at how you might map your impacts from your activities. So starting from what you know, which is what you do. We gave some examples, and there were some worksheets to help you on the way. So we're hoping that if you've completed, once you've completed the 2, if you've completed the earlier session at this stage, hopefully you'll understand what the Arts Council's ask is in terms of creating climate action and environmental policy, what the do's and don'ts are, what you should include in your policy, how to list your activities as an organisation and the impacts of those activities, and how to differentiate between impacts you can control and the ones that you can't. This was a kind of very critical slide we felt from that Claire presented at last week's session. And basically it covers what you should include in your policy. So the first thing is an introduction to your organisation and why climate and environmental action matters to you. What are your key environmental aims or commitments? What you most want to change? What are your key priorities, given who you are, what you do, where you do it, and so on. Maybe something around the principles that underpin your approach, who is accountable and responsible, and reference to plans for putting policy into place. That there's a huge amount of information contained in that. So we just wanted to break that down a little bit. This is, I suppose, still a recap a little bit of the earlier session, but I think for the both to work, it's useful to have a look back at that. And we created a worksheet. There was an earlier version of this that we created for last week, but this is a slightly more interactive one that we're going to be sharing via the Arts Council's website, and all of those sections are clickable, so you can go into this. There's three pages with 8 sections. So technically, if you can fill in those sections, you have the draft policy. And what we're hoping is that the sessions that will be delivered over the rest of the summer and into the autumn will enrich your understanding. So that'll allow you to go from having a draft version of your policy, at least you can get started, to something more complete. So I'm just going to break that down into chunks again to make that very manageable for you. So the first of the section, the first question in that worksheet is who you are, what you do, where you do it, who you do it with, your mission and purpose. Second is why climate and environmental action matters. What is your motivation? And of course, many of you will say your motivation is the fact that it's a requirement of Arts Council funding, but hopefully there's a motivation beyond that. And certainly from the people that you work with or you present work to or the artists that you're working with, there's a motivation there. And we know from speaking to you that many of you have that concern, but just feel overwhelmed by the work involved in putting this policy together. And that's why we're here. Your overarching objective, what you want to achieve, your key areas of impact and influence, are they buildings, productions, touring, supporting members, your key commitments, objectives and targets, and those will be informed by the impacts. And we looked at that in quite a bit of detail last week. What are your priorities? What areas are you going to focus on? Who else will you involve? And that's really the bit that we're going to look at in some detail today. And Noreen is going to go into that when I'm finished. So who are the people who will be involved in creating and implementing your policy? And I suppose we've devoted most of this session to that topic because we feel that is a really critical question. And if you do that well, your policy will be meaningful. If you don't do that so well, you will find that there will be roadblocks along the way. And finally, the very practical bit, who's accountable for that policy? When will it be reviewed? How will you share it and so on? So I just thought it might be useful to pick an example. So I've picked 3 different examples. This is a totally fictitious theatre company, but let's say you're a theatre production company, it could be a dance production company. So this, look, if a theatre production company was trying to answer that question, who you are, what you do, who you do it with and why, these are the kinds of sentences that might answer that question. So I've invented this roundtable theatre company based in Clonmel, creates new theatre productions, working with young drama graduates and performers at the beginning of their careers. These productions are created to tour throughout the island of Ireland in the most sustainable way possible. Our mission is to work with young and emerging performers, empowering them to create groundbreaking new theatre, which is accessible to a wide audience. So that's just a couple of sentences, which is really all you need to capture the essence of who you are and what you do. So I would say 4 sentences would be sufficient for most of you to capture that. And if we moved on to the second question, which is why climate and environmental action matters to your organisation. And again, I know it's a condition of funding, that's a big part of it. But for example, for this organisation working with young people, Roundtable Theatre Company recognises that the world is facing a climate emergency. We want to be part of the solution to addressing that challenge. Our work with young and emerging theatre practitioners inspires us to reduce the environmental impacts of what we do and how we do it. They expect us to face up to this challenge, and in collaboration with all of our stakeholders, we're committed to playing our part. So again, 1-2 sentences should cover that. Thirdly, what is your overarching objective or aim and what you want to achieve? So these are the kind of things. Is it just obviously what you include will depend totally on your organisation, but these are the kinds of things that an organisation might include. We aim to reduce our environmental impacts, and in particular our greenhouse gas emissions, in line with government targets. So that might be an ambition of yours. Or the Roundtable Theatre Company wants to become a leader in sustainable theatre making, supporting emerging artists and so on. We want to become an environmentally sustainable model of theatre making. So those are the kinds of overarching objectives or ambitions. And again, it doesn't need a huge amount, it should be concise and focused. And then I'm shifting the emphasis. Obviously, I know many of you are not necessarily theatre organisations, so you could be visual artists or involved in studios. So I've created another fictitious example, which is the amazing Mezzotint Print Studios and Gallery. And before anybody corrects me, I know this lady's not making a Mezzotint, she's probably making a lino cut, but just to illustrate, to give a little bit of a visual context for it. So what are the key areas of impact for example, a print studio and gallery? So the key impacts for the amazing Mezzotint Print Studios and Gallery are building energy, so heating for our gallery and studio spaces, as well as electricity for powering equipment and lighting, and waste from our various processes and discarded or unused materials. As a membership organisation, we provide services to many artists working in different print media. We believe we can work with our members to effect more widespread change. So it kind of shows that depending on what your activities are, depending on the kind of organisation you are, your key areas of impact and where you have the most scope to influence change will be different. And sticking with that fictitious example, If we move on to the section 5, what are your key commitments, objectives, or targets, given the nature and scale of your impact? So this is something a bit more specific. So the Amazing Methods Tint Print Studios and Gallery is committed to measuring and recording our energy use. So that's probably going to be a big part of any policy, that you make some commitment to measuring and recording your impacts, in this case, energy use. And this studio is committed to, again, aligning itself with the 2030 targets. We're committed to measuring, recording, and reducing our waste and water. Again, 2 big impacts would be for a print workshop. And then that commitment to creating an action plan. An action plan will be completed by January 2025, and this will set specific targets. For some of you who maybe have already advanced well beyond this point and maybe even have the beginnings or have completed environmental policy, you might have something a bit more detailed. But I think for any organisation that's starting out, it's totally acceptable to say that you're committed to measuring what your impacts are, because you're not at a stage where you've done that. And that would be the first kind of key focus of your policy. And then as things develop and as your policy, you will be reviewing your policy, and that will change. What are the priorities for this amazing method in Print Studio and Gallery? It's to work collaboratively with the artists we serve to identify real and effective ways to reduce our environmental impacts. We will also identify ways in which our progress in that journey can be shared with the wider printmaking community and with customers to our gallery. So again, these are just giving you examples, sort of ideas that might hopefully help you to come up with your own priorities in your own different contexts. And then I shifted to this is a concrete example, but just looking again at the resource organizations where the impacts and the activities are quite different, really, and looking at that question of who are the key people and groups responsible. And again, this is the area we're going to focus on in more detail in developing and implementing your approach. So this policy has been created by the executive and board of Performing Arts Forum in collaboration with our members. So you're indicating where it's come from and who's been involved. We are a membership organisation providing services and supports to performing arts practitioners throughout the country. This policy has been created in partnership with our members to ensure that their concerns and needs inform our journey to environmental sustainability. And this policy will be implemented by the staff team of Performing Arts Forum, led by the director and supported by members of the board. So again, this is a kind of, I've created this. This is fictitious in terms of the actual policy details, but the organisation is real, and it gives you a sense of the kinds of things they would be looking at. And finally, who's accountable for that policy? When will it be reviewed and when will it be shared? So the Director of Performing Arts Forum is responsible for implementing it. The members of the team, it's a small team, but they're responsible for helping to ensure that its aims and objectives are met. The board is responsible for reviewing and monitoring this policy, and the accompanying action plan will be updated annually. This policy and updates on our progress will be shared on the environmental page of our website and via social media. So that just gives you a sense, hopefully, as I say, the first 2 examples are fictitious, but that gives you a sense of how you might go about filling in that template. And as I say, that template will give you a kind of a draft version, potentially, of your policy that hopefully will be enriched by your own experiences and also by the information that we'll be giving you over the next few months. Over to you, Noreen.
So I suppose it's just important to get people on board. You know, we can have the tools in terms of how you create your policy and your action plan, but it's just so important to have your people on board. You know, change doesn't happen without people. And just when you're getting started, it's great to think about who should be involved and the benefits of that engagement. And I suppose one of the main benefits is trust. You know, I suppose in terms of creating that communication, with everyone feeling that they're involved in the creation of the policy and the action plan, then you're creating this sense of trust. And that's important because, of course, trust will encourage feedback. You know, no one's afraid of providing feedback that, you know, they might not think is altogether positive. It's also to help build long-term relationships. And I suppose that's very important in terms of the longevity of the policy. You know, I suppose having that trust in terms of further down the line, if any changes happen, and if there's a sense that, I suppose, you know, we need to amend or change the policy, it just has this, I suppose, this very open communication, and there is trust that people will feel comfortable to raise concerns if needed. I suppose a very important aspect to stakeholder engagement is a benefit of buy-in. So I suppose if you have buy-in, then of course everyone feels that the policy is theirs, even with your internal team, but also your external stakeholders. If they're involved in discussions and if they're invited to provide their feedback at the time that you're creating your policy, then they feel that they have I suppose, a stake in it. And again, that's very important for the long-term viability of your policy, because you feel that it's being fully supported, and that leads to credibility then. You're bringing everyone together, you're showing that there's transparency, everyone knows what's happening, everyone feels involved, and that's really, I suppose, consistently involving your team both internally and externally, and you're just really showing that there's trust and respect in the process, and that, I suppose, everyone they feel part of the creation of the policy, and there's legitimacy to the policy. And of course, then that lends to a sense of ownership. And I think this is extremely important, because everyone has a different perspective. So even within your internal team, there's going to be a lot of different, I suppose, input and views, and people will see the organization in a different way. It's very important that you invite in that external voice as well, because they really see your organization very differently. So, that's important as well, to include all of those voices. And then considering goals and objectives, even within your organization. And if it's a small organization, there could be very different goals and objectives depending on who you speak to. But this is, I suppose, possibly more important for that wider stakeholder community. For example, just an example of, if you're working with your local authority, or if the local authority is the landlord of your building, then it's probably no harm to look at some, I suppose, the local authority climate action plan, and just kind of really try to align all of those goals and objectives, because I think that if there's a sense that you're all working in a similar direction, then it's all, I suppose, supporting and the policy. So it's really, it's just so important to take a step back and really kind of consider all the different goals and objectives. And throughout all of this, like, what you're creating at this stage is that consistency of approach. I suppose you've engaged with your internal team, you've spoken with your wider stakeholders, and then you haven't overlooked anything that's important, or any concerns. I suppose once you know who your stakeholders are, you're communicating with them, you're updating them, everyone knows what role they have to play, and that's just really helpful in having that consistent approach. And that's very important too for, I suppose, the longevity of the policy. And I suppose all of this is leading to collaboration. You've built your communication with the people that matter, you've included them in the process, you're being transparent, you've involved them, you have provided them with the opportunity to give you feedback. There might be pitfalls along the way, but I suppose it's much better that that happens whilst you're creating your policy and action plan, rather than after it's being published. So all of that collaboration can only lead to better results. So I suppose there's a lot of advantages, and there's a lot of benefits to this approach, and so much more than what is here. But I hope you get a sense of how important that is, because really, it's without your people involved, it's going to be difficult to implement the policy. So I think it's very important to think about who the people are and how to involve them, and that's just for the long term, I suppose, success of the policy and the plan. But I suppose we can take a look at how to do that. I suppose we can look at all the benefits, but then, how do you do that? So I think we can move on to looking at the various stakeholders, and how do you identify and map those stakeholders. So I think that's quite easy when you're thinking of your internal team. I suppose some organizations will have quite a small team. So, your internal team, but what about those external stakeholders? So
I've moved on to the body and soul slide. You can see that, Noreen, can you?
I can indeed, yeah. You're
Right.
doing a great job. Thank you, Katrina.
No worries.
And then if you can move on to the next slide, we can just check if that's working. Lovely. The stickman slide. Lovely. Very good. So I suppose it's really like it's, and I know this might seem quite simple, but it's a nice process to go through in terms of making sure that you haven't forgotten anybody, because I think it's very important to consider, I suppose, and this is really for those wider stakeholders and your community and your audience and your artists and your suppliers and vendors. And it's just to ensure that that you've considered everybody and you haven't forgotten anybody, because some of these people can be your champions and are very important to include in the process. So there we see the internal team. Of course, we will know our internal people and we'll have a direct influence over them. But then that external team, they're very important, and we mightn't have a direct influence over them. That might be more of an indirect influence, but I suppose all the more reason to include them and to bring them into the process. So what we've done here is we've shared, I suppose, quite an in-depth example of stakeholder mapping. Now, if you go online and look at different formats of stakeholder mapping, and I suppose we don't like to use that term stakeholder mapping, it's a little bit corporate, but I suppose it's good to explain it as well. There's a lot of different ways of doing this. And people prefer different models, but we chose this as an example because it's very in-depth, and it, I suppose, divides it kind of looks at different approaches in terms of your audience or your community or your members, your suppliers and your vendors, knowledge sharing and policy influencers. But really, I suppose if you think about your audience, your community and your members, who do you have a direct influence over, an indirect influence, or then, you might have an influence indirectly on third parties. And this will very much differ between organizations, but it's just good to, I suppose, invite everybody into the room. And this is an example of this process in practice. So we used this, I suppose, process with an organization, and everyone was brought into the room, the internal team. So you had the facilities manager, the program manager, like the cafe owners of a cafe that was in the building. So we brought everybody in, and it was so interesting because everyone had a different perspective. So in terms of like the suppliers and the vendors, you had, some people saying, oh, it's the company providing us with their cleaning products. There was, I suppose, programming were saying, oh, it's our bubble wrap suppliers. And then the cafe owners, they had all had very different suppliers and vendors. Some were based in Ireland, some were outside of Ireland. So there was all these different, I suppose, contacts and who did you have direct influence over, who was, outside of your control. And, going through that, I suppose, process in terms of the knowledge sharing, who do you work with? Who are your peers? Are you part of organisations in Ireland and outside of Ireland? I suppose fellow theatres and galleries. With the policy influencers, I suppose, speaking about your board and again, in that wider context of local authority. But what's really interesting here is that you're getting all these different perspectives. And sometimes, you wouldn't ordinarily go through this process as an organization, but it's just really interesting to hear from everybody in terms of that. So I suppose what we'll do is just quickly run through some examples of what this might look like. And of course, this is just our, I suppose, kind of chatting, myself and Katrina and Claire, over what this might possibly look like for a venue such as a theatre or a gallery. But, we're delighted to have representatives from theatres and galleries here today. But, this might, I suppose what you'll find is that you might have these common stakeholders, but what will differ is, I suppose, their importance to each type of organisation. So what we thought here was that your staff or your volunteers would be really important for venues. Your audiences would be very important, your local community, and to a certain extent, there will be a priority on these different stakeholders. If we go to the next one, we can see how that might change for a resource organisation. You can see there that, members are hugely important, but, audiences might not be as important. And then I think the last one that we have there is visual artist studios. And again, that differs, you know, in terms of, I suppose there might be very similar stakeholders for all of you, but where it will differ is, I suppose, how important or how strategic they are to you. So that's, you know, and, you know, you might add a few of different stakeholders there. You might put different emphasis on them. But I suppose the purpose of this is just to get you started to think about this and to really consider, you know, your ecosystem in terms of your stakeholders, your partners, the institutions, the organizations, and the people that you work with. So it's really, I suppose, just to get the thought process going on all of that. Thank you, Katrina.
Not at all. Thanks a million for that, Noreen. So we're just going to look at maybe some of the practicalities about, you know, you can talk about trying to work with your stakeholders, but that's, and we don't really like to use the word stakeholders, but the people that you work with, that you're responsible for, that you're collaborating with, how do you involve them? And I suppose a core belief of mine would be that you try and involve as many people from the very beginning. So, you know, if you create a policy or the draft of a policy and then presented to the people that are going to be impacted by it, you might get less buy-in. Whereas if you can bring, if it's possible to bring people together, and those could be members of an organization, of course, they're going to be performers and artists that you work with. It could be your board members, and hopefully it would be, because they would have a critical role to play. It could be community groups that you might work with on a regular basis. It's going to vary enormously from one organization to another. But if you can bring those people together and just have a general conversation about acting on climate, I think that will definitely create a sort of better momentum. It'll create a better atmosphere around any action and policies that you're going to create. Because you might find that somebody, for example, you might have a box office manager who might feel, well, in their role, I don't have a huge role to play when it comes to climate action. But it turns out that that person is actually part of a climate action network group and very involved in tidy towns and so on. So those people actually have a huge amount to bring to what you're trying to do, but you mightn't always be aware of that. And this is a way of acknowledging what they know and the skills and capacity they will bring. So in terms of bringing people on board, I mean, obviously you want to be clear with who you're going to work with, but I would say initially, if you can make that initial invitation as wide as possible, then you can at least identify who's interested and who isn't. And ideally, I think if that's around, you can invite in a guest speaker, you might go and visit something. For example, you know, a local organic farm or whatever it might be, and that you create a sort of social atmosphere around that and give everybody an opportunity to talk about how they feel. If bringing people together physically is not an option, obviously you can do a Zoom meeting, you can do a survey. There's a whole range of other things that you can do, but just do include people at the beginning if you can at all. It's worth reflecting on what individual roles, you know, how in the individual roles within an organization might play a part in acting on climate and in creating your policy. And we tend to think that, you know, sometimes there's an emphasis on the whole idea of green teams and climate ambassadors. Really, it has to be your approach to addressing climate has to be kind of throughout your organization, and everybody really has to feel involved. So, you know, operations, finance, admin, all of these different roles. In some organizations, you might only have 2 or 3 staff members. So all of these roles, all of this capacity might be embedded in 1 or 2 people. But your approach to climate action will nonetheless affect all of those roles in different ways. So it's worth sitting down and just thinking about that. And we just wanted to give you a few cautionary tales and some examples. So I just want to credit artist Lisa Fingleton, who's a wonderful artist who's been really committed to acting on climate for many years, and is involved in a whole lot of art projects. Many of you, I'm sure, will know of her. And she did these drawings for me a number of years ago. And really, this is just to, I suppose, first of all, it's nice to use a bit of art to communicate with you all, but also, and some of you may have seen these drawings before, but, you know, I think that a tendency which I had, you know, to think that you're going to be a bit, maybe not a hero quite, but that you're going to be leading the charge. And at times, I don't think that's terribly helpful. And, you know, I was in a position in a previous role where I had quite a bit of influence, and I had a senior executive role, and that gave me a nice bit of power to do what I wanted to do. But really, I learned, I suppose, the hard way that that's not the most effective way to motivate people. People don't necessarily want to be told what to do. They want to feel that you've asked them, that you've involved them, that you've included them, that you've respected them, that you've acknowledged their own their contribution, the contribution that they're going to make. So it's from that particular experience that I would really urge you to involve people as early on as possible. And just one example of where an arts organisation, I suppose, in a sense, learned the hard way that by not involving people, you can create these roadblocks further down along the process. So this was an organisation that used a lot of disposable plastic cups for serving their customers during the intervals. They decided, the kind of senior executive and a colleague decided that they would change that. They would get rid of all these plastic cups and they would bring in reusable cups that could be washed and reused. And I think they did mention it to their staff in the bar area, but maybe not, didn't really consult with them at the level that they might have done. Anyway, they sourced these very reusable, washable plastic cups. The director was delighted with the result and came into the theatre a couple of weeks later to find that the cups weren't in fact being used. The bar staff had gone back to using the old disposable cups, and when asked why, they said, because we don't have time to wash them. So nobody had really considered, because the bar staff were not included earlier on, nobody had considered, had asked them. And of course, people working in other areas hadn't realised that there is a big implication for time, and time is money, in terms of washing, drying, and putting away all of those reusable plastic cups. So that's just an example of how things can go a little bit awry. And I just thought it would be nice maybe to include the environmental policy of an artist. So this is a wonderful artist called Ellie Harrison, based in Scotland, quite controversial at times, but she has her own environmental policy. And I think Brecon is going to pop that in the chat for you. Well worth looking at, and she updates it and looks at it annually. But she covers a whole range of areas. So, and I'm not suggesting that artists should go out and create environmental policies, but it's just interesting to see how her focus and her passion for addressing climate has really affected her work. Now, I think it's over to you again, Noreen.
Rina, thanks very much. Another example that we like is this is from Surrey. It's Watts Gallery Artist Village. So it's a wonderful example here of team engagement. Their approach was to set up an environmental sustainability working group. They appointed a trustee, environmental sustainability champion, and an environmental ambassador within their volunteer group. So it's quite a large group and organisation, but I suppose it just shows the example of how they really embedded sustainability within their team and their volunteer network. The next example is from Boundless Theatre. So this is a small group. They had 6 core staff members. It's a youth theatre. So they appointed a climate activist on their board. And then for each project that they worked on, they appointed a sustainability representative. So I suppose what was very effective also was setting up an advisory group of 15 to 25-year-olds as part of a production that was climate themed also. So just, I suppose, a different approach to how they engaged on the topic. And then the next example, I think, is one of my favorites. So this is an Irish example and just another different perspective. So the production crew on The Young Offenders, they sought to receive certification through BAFTA's Albert scheme. And I suppose what they did was this real practical approach, and also, I suppose, looking at behavioural change. And this was across the entire team. They organised an eco week. And in the next slide, I think we see the kind of breakdown of what they did. And it was just, I suppose, this was a really great example of engagement. It was a fun project, and it was looking at behavioural change. So they had this, I suppose, competition where they would have a point system on, you know, if you, I suppose, followed through on certain positive actions, you gained points, and then you lost points if there was negative actions. And just, I suppose, examples there of, you know, if you were using a keep cup or your own water bottle, you know, it addressed recycling and composting, carpooling. And it really did, I suppose, it went across the production team and involved everybody, and they had a little bit of fun along the way. So just a really, really nice example there of engagement and how they, I suppose, went about it, and just a very positive approach there, and that worked as well. So we do like that example as well. But I suppose just to, I suppose, recap on some of the do's and don'ts. I think, I suppose, before you start out on engagement, I think it's really important to understand and to map the key people you need to engage with. And how you do it, I suppose, is dependent on your organization and the approach you want to take. But it really is important to take the time to do that at the start. I suppose with your people, be open and transparent about what you wish to achieve. Very important to create that open communication and to make people feel comfortable that they can provide you with input and feedback and tell you things that you might not want to hear. And then important to actively listen to that and to take that on board. Once you start working on the policy, it's very important to provide regular updates on the progress of the policy and keep everyone informed. And of course, share the policy to encourage that co-creation and collaboration. You really do want that collaborative approach and to invite your team to update the policy then every few years so that it just doesn't end when you publish the policy, that continual engagement. And that input is very important. I suppose some engagement don'ts that we put together is, don't exclude key people that have been identified in the mapping stage. It might be difficult to get people, but it's just so worthwhile to speak to them and to get their input because you just don't know what perspective they might have, and that's very important. Don't forget to provide regular communication. Don't ignore critical feedback. I think critical feedback can be some of the best feedback you'll get. And then I suppose what's really important is just don't make assumptions that your team will support this. It really is about speaking with your team and making sure you have that buy-in. And as Katrina was saying earlier, exploring what your team are involved in outside of the organisation and tapping into their interests and I suppose maybe their passions in terms of sustainability outside of the organisation. And then don't make it difficult for stakeholders to communicate with you. It might be difficult to find the time or the way to communicate with people, but it's just so important to make that an easy process. And then again, I suppose in terms of the follow-up, put a follow-up process in place, maybe after 6 months or a year, and have that in the calendar so that, time doesn't pass and that it's not done. So there's just some, I suppose, do's and don'ts that we thought might be helpful.
And maybe just to follow on from that, Noreen, I think, because we're so conscious and we heard from so many of you as we went around the country of how overwhelmed and just the level of work that you have and the variety of that kind of work. But, sometimes our tendency is, and I've done this, is to put our head down and just say, we're just going to sit down and write this and it'll be done and dusted. But then what can often happen is then when that is made available to a wider stakeholder group or a wider group of people that you work with, you might then find people coming back and saying, well, why didn't you include this? And what about that? And I don't feel this is well covered. So that's why, even though it might seem faster to sit down and complete a policy at an early stage, if you have even to send out an email or to send out some kind of a survey to the people that you're engaged with, and it won't be everybody, even of those that we've identified in the stakeholder map, you're going to decide that it'll maybe be 3 or 4 key groups of people that you feel are relevant. So it is worth it, because if you don't do that, and we see it often in public life, people put their heads down, produce a policy or some kind of initiative, and suddenly there's a lot of negative feedback. So that's really what you're trying to avoid. It may seem time consuming at the time. It probably won't be as time consuming as you think, but it'll be time saving in the long run.
Yeah, I think that is the most important message from that, that you're just making the process easier for yourself in the long run. So I suppose just to recap then on where we are in terms of the webinars. So the upcoming webinar will be the 18th of June. So please let us know if you need any link to register for that, although I think that most people will have registered for that at this stage, and that is developing action plans for public-facing buildings and bigger energy users in the morning, and then in the afternoon, depending on which is relevant for you, developing action plans for office-based organisations and production companies. Following on from that, on the 25th of June, will be a session on measuring your impacts. And then going into July, we will have consecutive sessions on nature and biodiversity, buildings, energy, and materials and procurement. And then, as we mentioned, later on in October, November, we'll have sessions for festivals. And then, of course, we're continually working on, I suppose, policies and plans and updating the recording with the webinars and all of the slides with the link that Brecon made available as well at the start. So from tomorrow, you should see the webinars and the slides being made available there with the recordings.
So if anybody is attending just this session and maybe hasn't attended the earlier session, you'll be able to attend both, or put two together, or maybe even share that with other members in your organisation. And again, just I'm in danger of repeating myself, but those two sessions together should enable you to create a draft policy, using that template that will be available. We showed you briefly earlier on, but that will also be available on the Arts Council's website. And then these sessions that happen throughout the rest of the year will kind of enrich that. So you give you a little bit of time to settle, to maybe engage with the rest of the people in your organisation and work to complete that policy maybe a little bit later in the year.